This technique takes a little time to wrap your head around. It involves creating one shape, cutting it apart, and putting components together to form another shape. It's a fun one. To start the project, I've milled all my boards with a straight edge and with a consistent thickness of just over 1/2 inch. Based on those dimensions, I'll do a fast motion design here using graph paper. I've sketched out a curve, folded the paper so I can trace through the paper and duplicate the curve. But in this case, I'm going to cut it, flip it around, and get a completely different shape using the same set of curves. Now I've put pencil marks indicating the inside and outside diameters of the various rings to construct this. I've measured the diameters here, recorded those diameters so I can multiply the diameters times pi and divide by 24 segments. That gives me my various segment lengths. Then using the ruler, measuring the width of the boards for each ring gives me that information. Here's everything I need.
If you've spent any time viewing my Volume 3 DVD, there's a lesson there on what's called a puzzle bowl. Well, what I've just done here is very similar, although it is different. What confuses people is the fact that some of these rings, for example, ring 4 here, it's inside of ring 3. It's on the same elevation, but they are separate rings. Most people are used to seeing a stack of rings forming a vessel. Well, these are also stacked rings. Some rings are inside the diameter of other rings. It gets a little confusing. But with my plan in place, I can now go to work with my table saw, ripping material to the various, starting with the widest segments, and then going to the chop saw, cutting segments and putting rings together.
Here's my first ring, number 2, the widest one, a little over 3 inches wide. After ripping the material and making a first cut and adjusting my stop block, I have to cut 24 segments. I'll cut these from various boards. Here are all my rings, dry fitted together, ready to be glued. The gluing step is the same as all the other rings you've seen me glue together. I'm using hose clamps, I'm using the half ring technique. Because 24 segments take a little longer, I'm using Titebond 3, which will give me a little more working time. Here are my half rings drying. Now I've jumped ahead. I've got my halves put together, just removing the clamps. Next step is to get flat surfaces. I'm using my big disc sander to flatten one side so I can run them through my drum sander. I'll get pretty smooth surfaces on both sides before gluing these together. Now if you don't have that kind of equipment, here's how you do it. You've seen me do this before. It's just mounted on a disc of MDF with some hot melt glue. After a little bowl gouge and scraper work, checking with a straight edge, using a sanding block, I want it flat enough so pencil lines disappear very quickly. Now I can take this off and join this ring to wherever it goes. So here are all my rings. Here's the bottom one, number 2 ring. And then up the side here's the 4 rings that go on the outside. And then in the center, here are the 3 rings that'll get stacked in there. It's my habit to always, improve a drum sander surface with the disc sander. These are very wide rings from inside to outside. It takes a lot of clamps to drive all the excess glue out. In preparation for turning, I'm using my calipers to center this first ring on a full disc of MDF with a full bead of hot melt glue. I'll true up the outside, then true up the inside, and then go at this big flat surface trying to get it as perfectly flat and smooth as possible. I don't need the center portion to be flat. I'm only attaching rings to the inside and the outside. Using the sanding block and the pencil line trick gets this as perfectly flat as possible. Once I've achieved my flatness, I'm going to protect the outside surface with tape. I won't really have a chance to easily remove any glue squeeze out there after doing the center glue job. All 3 rings are stacked and going on there in one step. The tailstock does its job, and then a lot of clamps provide the pressure. In the meantime, I've put together the outside assembly of 4 rings. It's now been a few hours. I can put this outside together. I'm going to use a special plate of MDF that's been cut with these notches. I've centered my ring on the plate of MDF, held it in place with just a few dabs of hot melt glue. Plenty of glue. This center hole allows me to perfectly center that stack of rings, and the notches provide the space or the place for clamps. After these 8 clamps are in place, a utility knife cuts the hot melt glue, remove the plate, and then I've got room to put more clamps on. Works very well. Now the real fun starts, turning this thing. The first step is just to get rid of all the stair steps, all the rough edges, get a relatively smooth surface, and then I can see what I've got to play with, how much material, how much wall thickness I can shape. So once this is achieved, then I can start focusing on the overall shape. The most critical part might be this point right here, this edge, because it's going to be cut apart and put back together. Those 2 edges have to come together and form a continuous curve. It's really important that this area right here be just a few degrees less than 90 degrees. After achieving a good curve on the outside, I'll focus at getting a 5/16 inch wall thickness in this area. But one of the key components to this is the gap that squeezes the candle. I've positioned the candle there, selected the squeeze point, measured the candle, measures just a little over 0.8 of an inch. Therefore, the difference in elevation of these 2 surfaces needs to be a little less than 0.4. This piece of wood confirms that. Otherwise, I'd have to take a little more wood off this surface before doing the flattening. Now I'm working on the final, wall thickness and just trying to get a nice smooth curve here all the way around. I can't measure the wall thickness towards the inside. There's no way to get in there. So all I can do is focus on a nice set of curves here. Now with the inside all nice and smooth, a nice set of curves and all sanded, it's time to turn this around. I've taken an old jam chuck and turned a groove which very precisely fits this rim. I've got a nice tight snug fit. It runs nice and true. A few beads of hot melt secure it. I've taken the faceplate off and turned that MDF away. Now to check my wall thickness as I go, I've drilled a series of holes. I've used this piece of wire with a bent hook end, and that piece of tape allows me to check the wall thickness. Those first few holes are all consistent. The first holes I had access to both sides, but as I get away from that outside, the wall is much thicker, as I knew. So it's a matter of turn a little and check frequently, turn a little more, keeping a nice smooth curve, but sneaking up on a consistent wall thickness all the way through. Once I've achieved that, sand it to 400 grit. Some places require a little hand sanding. Getting it out of the jam chuck just requires a little bit of removal of this hot melt. It should pull right out of that slot. I've marked the seams that I want to cut it with this blue tape. I'm cutting right on the edge of the blue tape. So I'm going to make 4 pieces out of this using that tape as my guide. Pretty simple bandsaw job. Here's the seam where I drilled the holes. Now once I've got these quarters, as you'll see, in order to get a bricklay effect, I've got to trim about a half a segment's worth off each end. Here are the little cutoffs that I had to do in order to get that bricklay effect. Here's a dry fit showing all the rubber bands that'll hold this together. That piece of wood in the neck area is the key. Without that little piece of wood, the rubber bands would squeeze the top in and open up the seam. So glue's been applied. I'm putting a rubber band around the neck area just to secure things, and then just putting bands on every which direction, applying plenty of pressure. It's a very effective clamp job. The last challenge is to clean up that glue seam and the outside edges. I'm using a card scraper here. That's also getting rid of any hot melt glue residue, which would mess up my sandpaper. A variety of sanding techniques, whatever works for you. This extension for my power sanding disc comes in real handy. Otherwise, I'd have to be in there doing it by hand. Here's one last check of the tightness for the candle. That worked out really nice. After signing it, I applied about 3-4 coats of this water-based poly finish. In the bottom of my holder, I need a little cup to hold the base of the candle. So here I'm turning some ebony, fitting it up to the candle bases, a little sanding, part this off, do a little customizing on the bottom there with the disc sander. The cup seems to sit in there just fine. In between coats, I hit all the surfaces with 400 grit sanding mops. That extension again came in handy. Cleaning things with a tack cloth in between coats. Here's a dry fit with my cup in place. I want a nice rough surface for the epoxy to be, particularly effective. It doesn't take very much. A little bit of epoxy in there. The tape is really just my guide on where to position this. I'm using the candle to press down on that cup and get it nice and straight. Tape can come out, and put this aside and let that epoxy dry.
Let me talk about this project just a little bit more. A couple of tips. Your wall thickness. Really take the time to focus on that wall as you check with the wire through those little holes. Don't rush it, because that wall thickness is there for everybody to see forever. So really work on that. The other important thing is this gap where the candle goes. If you miss that, you really don't have much of an opportunity to correct it. So before you cut this apart and put the halves together, you really got to make sure that that gap is just about right. There's some springiness there. Better a little too tight than too loose. If you get it really tight, then you could always do a little sanding in that spot of contact with the candle and make it work. Regarding the size, a smaller original diameter, this would have been a little shorter from end to end. But there's also the option of making that original diameter a little bit bigger, a few inches in diameter bigger. If I had done that, instead of getting 4 quarters, I could have cut the original glue up into 8 pieces. And instead of creating just 2 of these, I could have created 4 of these. So that's another option. One more thing, the base. This is rocking, it tips. It doesn't tip over, but with the slightest provocation, it rocks. I kind of like that. But if you don't, a little power sanding create a little flat spot on the underside, and it'll sit, quite nicely. That's a personal choice. Anyway, have fun with these. It's an unusual technique. It has a high level of how'd you do that.